So what I'm obviously talking about today is governance, and what I would like to focus on in my presentation is some key elements to do with governance. So I'll start from the beginning rather than just starting from the top. So I'm actually starting somewhere in the middle. So the focus is really, what is corporate governance? Why is it important? Who's it relevant to? And what are the key principles for corporate governance? And why it's absolutely essential that it's a top-down approach for it to work. So throughout the presentation, I'll also give you some examples, which are real examples that I've been involved with, or other people who I have worked with have been involved with, and hopefully they might give you some assistance. And at the conclusion, I'm very happy to answer any questions. I'm using some generic terms, given that governance covers a range of different concepts. So I'm using the word organisation. I'm not going to talk about companies and enterprises and charities, just organisation, but it covers everything. In terms of who are the members of the governing body, I'm calling them directors. But as you know, that refers to council members, it can be management committee members, there's a whole raft of different discussions. And the other thing I'm talking about, the governing body itself, I'm using the word board. So I'm not using the term management committee again, or councils, but it does apply to them, of course. So what is corporate governance? When I say I do work in corporate governance, people look at me blankly. People think, oh my God, haven't you got something better to do? But really, it's just because I think that it's a word that suddenly gets bandied around, even though it's been a focus from the last 10 years, particularly since the GFC. And so what it tends to happen is people think it is just more bureaucracy. It's complex. It actually doesn't relate to me in the organisation I'm in. So look, there's one thing that you will not be surprised about, is there is no single universally agreed to definition. However, there are a number of organisations that have been working over the last number of years that have some very key concepts that run through all of their considerations. So look, I'll just go through a couple of them. Firstly, there's the Governance Institute of Australia, and their definition is, governance encompasses the system by which an organisation is controlled and operates, and the mechanism by which its people and the organisation are held to account. Ethics, risk management, compliance and administration are all parts of corporate governance. From the broader perspective, the OECD states that corporate governance involves a set of relationships between the organisation's management, its board, its stakeholders, and if it is a commercial entity, obviously shareholders. Corporate governance also provides the structure through which objectives of an organisation are set, the means of attaining those objectives, and the monitoring of performance are determined. And the third one, which is actually a common definition that runs through company directors, and I'm sure you've all heard about them, and also the ASX, is that corporate governance is the framework of rules, relationships, systems, policies and processes within and by which authority is exercised and controlled in organisations. So it encompasses the mechanisms of the organisation and those in control, and making sure that they are held to account. The really interesting thing with that definition, and if I'm going to say I particularly favour one, it tends to be that one, is that it actually came out of the HIH insurance case, which was the largest corporate failure in Australia. So that was from Justice Neville Owen, and he reaffirmed that same view about 5 years later, following his involvement in the Bell Group cases. So governance and corporate governance really deals with everything that's going on in an organisation, whether it's your legal obligations, whether it's contractual obligations that you have, and everything that's in the day-to-day running of the business. The key thing is that the board has a pivotal role in the environment for governance, and that cannot be underestimated. So I'll just going through very quickly the key things that come through every definition, and apart from the ones I've gone through, all the others that you can dig out from research, it's based on relationships, and they're the relationships in the organisation and outside the organisation. It's how authority is exercised and controlled, and that's through a framework of rules, systems, policies and procedures. It's accountability for decisions made and the actions that are taken, and there's performance monitoring in how the organisation is going. So the next thing is, why is it important? Well, one of the key things is that it's focusing on achieving objectives and outcomes, and that's been reaffirmed in a number of documents that have been written, including the Department of Social Services Corporate Governance Handbook. And basically it focuses on having strategic and business planning. It helps with risk management, financial management and reporting, human resources planning and control, and compliance and accountability systems. Okay, so they're all very nice words that we hear all the time, but what does it really mean in the business? Well, really, it's talking about how you run your business and what you do in your business, the confidence that your customers, clients and the broader community have, the level of professionalism and transparency that the organisation has, and that includes its staff and volunteers. How the organisation can meet increasing community expectations, and then the responsibilities and accountabilities that are particularly relevant to you, which is you are using public money and being accountable for public money. And look, that is the same, to be honest, whether you've got a company, whether you are a membership organisation. You actually don't own the money, it is not yours. You are responsible as the board and the staff for how that money is used. So in a very practical way, some of the key elements of governance that can work, and I've been talking to a few people who are right in the thick of governance, some people who are starting on governance, and some people that are thinking about it. So if I'm repeating stuff that you already know, when I look around and you're happy with it, please just nod, because I know that people are at different stages at the moment. But really, benefits of corporate governance can assist in improving efficiencies in the organisation. It can improve the risk management, and if you can improve your risk management and start to mitigate risk, then you can actually reduce costs. For example, insurance premiums. It can assist with the recruitment and retention of effective, loyal and reliable staff and volunteers. It can increase opportunities to work with other organisations in a mutually beneficial way. And Terry mentioned that yesterday, in how you can actually share some back-of-house services, how you can actually think about you can get benefits by working together. But it also is part of the reason for corporate governance is people like to have that confidence in who they're working with. It can also ensure effective relationships with suppliers. If you have that, they trust you, they know you're going to pay. They will actually be supportive in long-term relationships, even as you know things can get difficult. The other thing that can also be of a benefit is it's increasing opportunities for you to be able to tender for services because of the systems that you will have in place and those accountabilities, which just become part of how you are operating, so that is your base. So you're actually not having to do a lot more than you would be intending to do anyway to run a successful business. And the other thing, of course, is reputation, and that can't be underestimated. So good governance is important for maintaining and hopefully improving reputation. Now look, there's a couple of important things to remember. One is it takes time to implement. So you need to be patient and you need to be committed. I was talking to some people over the last couple of days, and the suggestion is that when you actually manage to achieve some things and get somewhere, celebrate the small wins. It's a bit like, how do you eat an elephant? You cut it up and eat it in small chunks. So it's really how you actually approach where you're going in this. The other thing to remember is you already have a lot of things that you do in terms of governance, or you think of compliance. So you are already doing things to do with safety, work health and safety, safety of vehicles, all sorts of other things. You've got employment work that you do. So what the corporate governance does is it brings it together. So it's not bit here, bit here, bit here, bit here. It's actually within a framework that makes it understandable and easier to make sure, A, that you're not duplicating things, which can always happen in organisations, and B, makes it easier again to communicate from the board and management right through to the rest of the staff. The other thing it needs to be is, or recognise, you may need upfront costs. There may be capital as part of going through the governance process, but those benefits can be redeemed down the track. The other thing is, it needs to be practical, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. You all have different organisations, you have similarities. Some of you are working in very different areas. So it's so important not to think you take a tome off the shelf and that is how it works. It isn't. It's how you take what I'm going through, the principles and the concepts, and adapt that for your environment and for your organisation. And the other thing is, it also needs to be a combined effort. So you're board driven essentially, but with management and also staff. So you end up with that clear understanding of what we're doing, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, and it's worthwhile. And sometimes we can actually forget, and I've actually seen it happen with different organisations where that sort of clarity doesn't come through. I'll give you an example of one of the organisations that I have worked with, where there was looking to do some major structural change. And it was to do with how the business was running. It was bringing in another part of an organisation. There was concern about how it would operate. The key thing that was done by the chairman and the board was actually explaining to the group what was happening. So it wasn't that it was something that was happening out there and people didn't know. It was actually included as part of their operation. So there was whilst there was concern, I mean, am I going to be okay? Am I going to be out of a job? What can I do? By giving people the understanding, and look, nothing's going to happen without us telling you, and you will know first. And it's making sure, for example, when you're doing that, you actually let management know, you let staff know, then you let your stakeholders know. So it's not that things come bouncing back around through rumour. So I've gone on a bit long there, but anyway. So in terms, I've gone through why it's important. So who's it relevant to? It's relevant to everybody, or every organisation. And in fact, when you think of it in our personal lives, we actually have corporate governance things that we do as well. So it doesn't matter whether you're a public or a private sector beast. And when you look around this room and CT operators in New South Wales, it's really interesting because most of you are incorporated under the Associations Act, which is managed by Fair Trading. Then you have quite a few of you who are auspiced under local governments. So you also have the legislative framework that they operate under, and there's a whole raft of legislation that you comply with. There's some that come under the, and I'll get it right, Aboriginal Corporations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act, 2006. Then there's a few of you who are under the Corporations Act. So you're actually companies limited by guarantee and also have charity status. And then finally, there's a few that are auspiced under the New South Wales Government. So what does that mean? Why did I bother to say it? What it means is it really doesn't matter who you're established under, what legislation, the obligations on the board, management, are the same. Maybe slightly different wording, a little bit easier, some's come in earlier than later, but effectively the same. And I'll use the example of the New South Wales Associations Act, which had the changes in 2009. The new requirements for directors is that you have to disclose any conflicts of interest between the owners, their own affairs and the affairs of the association, and you're not to use your position or information from the organisation for a dishonest purpose. Another key one is also that your actions have to benefit the whole of the organisation. Now they're common that come across, and in fact it's good to see because that aligns the New South Wales Act more closely with the Corporations Act and their requirements. So top-down approach, and hopefully that your boards aren't quite running like that, but I did appeal to my sense of humour. So why a top-down approach? It has to be to work. Organisations I've mentioned such as AICD, ASIC, Governance Institute, OECD, they all have principles, and of course all the principles aren't exactly the same or worded exactly the same, but they do have common themes. And when you look at all of the research, the only way that it works, and you may not like me being that definite, but really the only way that it works is where it is driven by the board. That also means that the board has to engage and work effectively with management, of course, and then obviously the CEO. And again, going back to what I said before, it has to flow through to the rest of the organisation. So look, I'd just like to quickly refer to the principles from the ASX guidelines and for corporate governance, and these were updated and introduced again, another version on the 1st of July this year. So it's the most up to date. So the principles that really are relevant for you are laying a solid foundation for management and oversight, structuring the board to add value, acting ethically, safeguarding the integrity of reporting, making timely and balanced access to information for all stakeholders, respecting the rights of all stakeholders, and recognising and managing risk. So it's not a too long or turgid document, but you might want to have a look at it at some stage, and it's freely available on the website. So look, what I'm going to focus in on is what are the common themes and how are they particularly relevant to the not-for-profit sector and for community transport. So the headings I will go under are the roles and responsibilities of the board composition and effectiveness, the culture and ethics, integrity and accountability, so that's also communication and performance, and then risk management and recognition. So the role and responsibilities of the board. There's quite a few. However, the key message is that really the board has to be focusing on what they do and be transparent in what they do. There's got to be clarity. You've got to be really clear about what the responsibilities of the board are as a group and as individuals. You need to also be very clear about what are the expectations of the board from the organisation, and then in terms of the role and also the role of management. So it cascades down. The important thing to remember is that the board is there to govern, not to manage. So what does that mean in reality? Well, I'll refer to some research that's been around for some time, and people you've probably heard of, and it's Tricker and Hilmer. And they actually looked at the functions of the board and said, okay, well, what really are the key functions of the board? And they said 4 components. 1 is formulating strategy, 2, making policy, 3, monitoring and supervising, and then 4, providing accountability. So they then did an analysis, which hopefully it's reasonably clear, And what they did is they plotted it in two ways. One is they said what is long-term and what is short-term, and then they looked at the key elements that were internal and external to the organisation. And it's actually quite a useful framework to think about where things are happening. And then the thing that's actually in the middle, which is one of the key functions of a board, is employing the CEO and obviously the performance of the CEO. So that's why that sits in the middle. So formulation of strategy, key, essential for the board. And it's long term and it sets the direction for where you're going. The policy making also focuses on long term, but you're also using it in your operations in the short term. So it's really making sure, going back to that definition, that you've identified what you need in your policies, relationships, again, that linkage and that framework. Going back on the other side, which is the shorter term, is monitoring and supervising activities. And then the other one is providing accountability. And that's really how the organisation is accountable to its external stakeholders. Again, which for you is the community, it's your funding organisation, it's the regulators. So what really does the board do? And what should the board be doing? Well, look, it varies a bit, but your board needs to be very careful where it focuses. So it tends to cover things like determining, reviewing and maintaining the vision, which we've said, approval of short and long-term strategies, fine. Approval of annual budgets, absolutely. Approval expenditure over predetermined limits. And that is also very important and very clear when you're looking at an organisation and how money needs to be spent and what you need to invest in. There was a case a number of years ago where a board in a not-for-profit was very happy with what the managing director was doing. The managing director actually went and negotiated some agreements and a substantial investment in excess of $5 million without board approval. And the board found out after it had actually been done. Providing a check on the integrity of external financial and non-financial reports, monitoring activities, and effective engagement with stakeholders. So what does management do? Well, the AICD suggests that really management is actually, and the CEO and senior management are implementing the strategy approved by the board. They're the ones that are getting the results and delivering the outcomes. And they're doing that through the day-to-day running of the organisation without too much direct director and board involvement. So things that boards might need to think about in terms of being very clear with their roles and responsibilities, and for those that are already doing it, this is where you can nod. Okay, having a board charter and protocol which defines the roles of the board and the types of decisions that are reserved for the board. When the board then delegates, and there'll be certain functions to management, there should be a very clear statement of what is being delegated and how it's being delegated, so people are very clear what they can do and how they can do it. Whether the protocol covers the relationship between the board and the CEO, that can also be covered, that depends. Are the roles of the chair and the chief executive, are they clear? Might need to think about that too. But the board must ensure that, again, that you're going to hate me because I keep nagging on it, is to have in that framework all of the systems and policies and processes in place so that you can operate efficiently. One of the things I think people forget is if you don't have clear, and it doesn't mean you need to be absolutely dictatorial. Oh, actually, no, sometimes you do. But you need to be very clear about how things can be done. Yes, there can be discretion, but it makes it so much easier for people to perform their roles and work together. With new directors, it's important to that they get a letter of appointment which actually says what their roles are, what their liabilities are, and also what their term is. So again, it is reaffirming when they are actually joining what they're required to do. And look, I just want to make one comment about representative boards, because it's something that I've been involved with, and I know that a lot of you are. And one of the things that needs to be considered with directors on those boards. It is great that you have people who are representing different sectors or regions on boards, because you need that diversity, and that is why it's done across a lot of industries, including yours. Tourism industry does it, mining industry does it to a lesser extent, but it is great to do. However, whilst you might be appointed or on a board because you have been nominated by, let me say, Restaurant and Catering Australia, or the Airports Board. When you're on that board, you are actually not representing the interests of your sector. You are actually need to be focused on the best interests of the organisation that you are on the board of. Some of you may say I'm telling you how to suck eggs. Unfortunately, I've seen some very sad examples where that has not worked effectively. I've also seen an amazing example, and I'll bore you with that. I'll go back to the tourism industry, National Council, which had representation from every sector in the industry, as well as government agencies. Major inquiry into training a number of years ago, and obviously had to put a position. So what happens? We have a number of, and two particular parts in the sector have absolutely opposing views on a particular issue that related to taxation. And obviously taxation comes into all things. So what was done as part of that National Council is they got together, agreed on what was the key outcomes that were required for the industry as a whole. That was agreed to. The specific issues that these two other organisations had were not included as part of that group submission. Everybody signed off on it, presentation to the commissioners. Each group stood up and said, we fully support and we are signatories to the submission that has been put in on behalf of the industry. However, we have some specific issues that we want to raise with you, which is, we're separate. The other group got up and did exactly the same thing. So what it effectively meant was, when they were working as part of that National Council, they focused on what was best for the organisation and the industry. When they wanted to speak on their own behalf, they did raise their issues. And I think that's really important, to be able to do that and recognise the importance when boards are making decisions. Okay, purpose and strategy. I'll do that really quickly because you already know about the vision. Got the vision as set. Then you need to set your strategic objectives, align with your vision, work with management. We're coming down. Work with management to put the plans in place to actually meet those objectives going back up, and then support management in implementing those plans. So again, it's that clear linkage about what the organisation's doing. The other thing is also is review, and it's one of the key things that comes out of corporate governance, is that just because you've done something now doesn't mean it stays there forever. So it's important to review things, for example, every 2, 3 or at least 5 years, when you're looking at your strategic views, your vision, your mission, and then what you're doing, to make sure that it's still relevant to what you need to do and if there's a changing environment. Okay, board composition and effectiveness. It's very important, and this is again in all of the literature, for boards to have members with the appropriate skills and experience and knowledge to guide the organisation forward. So conducting an analysis of really what do you need, what does the board need, what skills do you need, and then looking to see how you can get those skills. Now look, there's a raft of ways to structure boards, and I know you have them under constitutions and that can be a pain to change them, but there is all sorts of different capacities to make sure that you can have the ability to get particular skills on if you need to. Again, another example from a couple of years ago, particularly needed some skills that weren't covered under a representative board. So in fact, the decision was taken to actually create a board position which would need to be approved by all of the other directors, which allowed for specific skills that were needed at the time. And the term for that role was then specified for the length that they thought. So it may not be exactly the same length term, but it could be 2 years because that was the issue. And then that person would come off and they could put somebody else on, or you leave it vacant, but you actually have that capacity to do that. So look, just again, you can nod for those of you who are already doing this, but please just think about it in your own organisations. The appropriate size of the board, relevant board committees, do you need an audit and finance, a risk, whatever. But that depends on the size and the nature of the organisation. And please remember that too. You don't have to have the same corporate governance structure that the Commonwealth Bank has. Actually, that's probably not the best one to mention at the moment. BHP has. Think about what you need for your organisation. What's the appropriate term and how do you have extensions? So you need to get that balance between the fact you have got corporate knowledge and experience from board members, but you need to get new board members on. So there's, again, different mechanisms. Do you do a 3x3, 3-year term with a reference going through on, sorry, I'm just looking at somebody else for a signal for me. And also, how do you stagger approaches? The program for induction of directors. And that is very important. Sometimes we just forget about it. You don't learn to be a director by osmosis. We don't learn our jobs by osmosis. So it is important to do that and give them the access to everything they need. Be incredibly transparent. And also look at the development opportunities that you need for the board. What training do they need and what skills? The other thing is, in terms of independence, the important issues that you need to consider, potentially about if you're blurring lines and conflict of interest. And I'll just mention one and I'll come back to it later. One thing is, if I happen to be a client, but I really want to go on the board, should you let me do it? But also, should I be thinking about doing it? So again, it's what happens in my role as a client or as a customer versus actually being part of the corporate direction of the place. Okay, practicalities of boards. Processes we know. Please make sure, and again, you can nod if you're doing it. Board meetings, clear and concise agendas, papers delivered on time. Enough time for people to read them. Directors who read them, not reading them in the taxi on the way to the board meeting. None of us would know people like that though. Relevant and robust debate. Minutes recorded and circulated and finalised quickly. Conflicts of interest dealt with appropriately, I'll come back to that. And board decisions adhered to and not changed out of session and not undermined through lift and corridor discussions. So the board's performance, including performance of the chair and individual directors, should be assessed and should be discussed, and it's not easy. So don't necessarily think about that's the first thing you have to do, but just at least think about how you would do that, because people do find it very challenging. Okay, one of my favourite ones now is culture and ethics. Culture, how we act, how we behave, how we interact, can impact on all of our people. It can impact on how we do business. The board obviously has a key role in this, and some commentators have said that the board can ill afford to ignore culture. The ASX principles note that acting ethically and responsibly goes well beyond mere compliance and legal obligations. It involves acting with honesty and integrity and in a manner that is consistent with reasonable expectations of direct stakeholders in the broader community. It's not just being a good corporate citizen, it's seen to be a good corporate citizen. And it's incredibly important for that to be part of how the place operates. There's some very useful stuff again in the ASX guidelines on what you might include in a code of conduct to cover off on those sorts of issues. Conflict of interest. One area I have had a lot of dealings with, and I'm sure you probably have too. And it is a primary focus in corporate governance across this country. So every decision by the board must be impartial and cover off on the interests of the organisation. If there's a conflict of interest, the director is no longer to be involved and is not in a position to have any involvement in either how to handle it or the issue being dealt with. So look, the principles are you identify the conflict, it's disclosed. Once it's disclosed, then that director can no longer be involved in any of the decision making that goes around that. The general processes that relate to conflict of interest, again, go back to policies, again, training, how to deal with those issues. And look, if you're uncertain, get advice. I mean, serious professional advice. Don't just talk to somebody that you know that suggests you might like to do something. It is incredibly important to get that sorted out. It's also an issue that's relevant to staff and volunteers in any organisation. In terms of specifics for the directors, is actually declaring any interests, and it's not just saying it's a conflict of interest, but any interests when you join a board. Every board meeting, and in the organisation I was with 2 years ago, every board meeting, the standing first item was directors' declarations, and that was updated every board meeting. There's also a register that then confirms, so you can actually link them back to say, well, so-and-so's been on this one, they've come off, they've gone back on, and those sorts. So again, it's showing that you're being transparent and consistent. Integrity and accountability is the fourth one, and that is really focusing on the flow of information to the board that aids decision making, transparency and accountability to external stakeholders, and the integrity of the financial statements and other key information that needs to be safeguarded. The key element here is how to make sure that you have covered off on all of those, because it's really how is the organisation tracking, what are your major risks, are there any updates you need to give the board, and what are any important regulatory compliance and reporting obligations. Now again, that sounds incredibly, oh my God, how am I going to do it? There's some really good ways, and again, I've seen it, it's a one-pager, regulatory compliance. Listing it down, key ones, is it up to date, has it been done? Yes, and if there's any comment, we have to do it again or whatever. And it's one of those things the board can look at, and as a director, to make you comfortable. Oh, okay, yes, okay, yeah, well, good, we've paid the tax here, we've done this, we've submitted this to fair trading, and then if you really want to know something, you then dig deeper. The other thing that's important is performance and how you measure it. So again, it's really about how the board decides what is important to measure, and also it has to be really meaningful, capable of being measured. So it's nice to say, oh, we'd like to know this, but in fact you actually can't measure if you've been successful. You need to be timely. It's got to be cost effective. There's no point in wasting a heap of money just to get some small amount of information. And wherever possible, keep it simple in how you're doing it. That's important. And again, your external reporting, there's opportunities for, again, training, and also getting external advice. One of the things I will focus in quickly is in the not-for-profit sector in the last few years, having discussions with auditors, is fraud. Credit card fraud, and it's been in a number of sectors, and it's been running for at least 4 or 5 years, and it's been going for quite some time. and there's major cases that we've all heard of. Okay, the key things that they talk about are the lack of controls and clear delegation policies. Who does what and who approves? And there has to be that approach, and the lack of transparency and consistency with how it's being done. The last one I'd just quickly like to get to is risk, which links into almost everything we do. So risk is a key board responsibility, and it's one that has to again go through the culture. So a conventional approach is really, and if you have a look at the slide, it's identify the risk, analyse it. Is it major, minor, whatever? What can you tolerate? How do you deal with it? And then review it again. So has it worked out, the ways that you're dealing with it, managed so by risk avoidance, risk transfer or risk mitigation. So again, putting in a simple framework to look at it can really work. Okay, so corporate governance, what is it? I've already gone through enough, but I just want to talk about a couple of key points and reiterate them. It takes time, but it's worthwhile because it delivers tangible outcomes. It needs commitment. The bottom line is it needs to be practical, understood by everyone involved in the association or with the association or the organisation. It's the framework, which I've talked about, rules, policies, clearly written, clearly communicated, available to everybody and updated and reviewed. Making sure it's really relevant to you. Please don't just pick things off the shelf. Think about it and make sure that it works for your organisation. And as I've said before, and everything in governance is review it. Monitor, review, amend if you need to. And the final thing I'd just like to say is that whilst corporate governance is top-down, it's essential for bottom-up approach to make sure you've got it's accepted and you've got the commitment of the entire staff and volunteers of the organisation. Thank you.
Pamela, I'd like to ask a question if it's all right. What happened to the 5 million? What happened? Well, actually, did they get it back or did they lose it?
No, because the venture actually went belly up, and they actually did lose some money. However, they've got really good governance procedures and accountabilities in place.
Now. Okay. Well, that's something, isn't it?
There was a big write-down over a few years.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
I have a question for Pamela. What is the perfect number of people on a board?
Good question. There's no perfect number. However, it depends on the board. So again, the minimum is 3. You have to have 3, and they need to be Australian residents here too. Some people say a maximum is 9. And that is still large. And I've had to deal with boards that were sometimes 15 or 16. So it is smaller. They say is better. At one stage, one of the large boards I was involved in, they actually had an executive committee who did a lot of the work involved. I've seen other structures of boards where you have your corporate board, which is all of the accountabilities, and that's a group of about 6. And then underneath that you have other councils, subcommittees, you can call them whatever you like, which really deal with the specifics. So it could be if you're dealing with policy issues, you might have a larger group of people involved, particularly when you're looking at sector or regional issues. So
I think you're saying choose carefully.
Choose carefully and don't go too big.
Governance is a big thing with us at the moment. So a lot of us are looking for diversity within our governance body. How can we build a diverse governance body into our constitution? Is that possible? Can we call for diversity within the constitution, and can we really be held to that?
It's an interesting one, and I haven't seen one that's done. However, have had a constitution that has gone back and said you can have so many directors. The chair, could be independent, or it doesn't matter. So the chair can come out of, because the chair's elected by the board, and then it can actually specify and say, okay, there has to be 3 from this. In fact, the previous organisation had 3 from one side, 3 from the other division, and then you had an independent chair. Then there was the ability that you can put also that says we want to have the opportunity to put people on and whether you use diversity or skills-based, you can say you want diversity, but then how you define diversity comes back to it. So is diversity in terms of gender, ethnicity, particular skills? So yeah, you can do it that way.
Thanks very much, Pamela.